From the moment I walked into his office that day, I could feel the charged electric tension between us. His eyes lingered a second too long. His voice held a softness I'd never heard before, and every glance he threw my way felt like a secret only we shared. Little did I know that crossing that invisible line would lead us both into a world of hidden desires and forbidden encounters that neither of us was prepared to resist. Our story is one of daring passion and an unquenchable connection that kept pulling us back, no matter the risk. Before we dive in, don't forget to hit subscribe and show your support for LGBTQ+ voices. Sharing these stories helps celebrate our community and keep stories like this alive. Thank you for being here. Let's begin. Working for Mr. Graham was like stepping into another world. He was 70, but carried himself like a man half his age, with a sharp mind and an air of authority that made everyone in the office hang on to his every word. There was something hypnotic about the way he moved, the subtle confidence he radiated even as he handled high-stakes deals and complex problems. I'd always been in awe of him, and, if I were honest, maybe a little more than that. That evening, as the office emptied out, I found myself alone with him again. I'd been reviewing reports, lost in my thoughts, when he appeared in my doorway, leaning against the frame with that unreadable expression. The shadows softened his sharp features, making him look almost like a different person, someone more mysterious, more alluring. "It's late," he said, voice low. "Still working?" I nodded, feeling a rush of nerves. "Yes, Mr. Graham. Just finishing up the final numbers for the quarterly report." "Dedication," he murmured, stepping into the room. "A quality I value." His gaze held mine for a moment longer than usual. There was something in his eyes, a warmth, a curiosity that sent a thrill through me. I watched as he shut the door quietly behind him, crossing the space between us with a casual grace that made me hold my breath. He stopped just beside me, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from him, and looked down at the stack of papers on my desk. "You're doing good work," he said, his voice softer than I was used to. His hand drifted, almost unconsciously, to my shoulder, resting there in a way that felt both natural and electric. "I knew you'd be an asset from the moment I hired you." "Thank you, Mr. Graham." My voice came out in a whisper, barely audible. The warmth of his hand sent a surge of energy through me. I felt rooted to the spot, unable to break away from his gaze. "Do you mind if I give you some advice?" he asked, his hand lingering on my shoulder. "Of course not," I managed, heart pounding. He leaned closer, his face inches from mine, the hint of cologne reaching me in waves. His fingers brushed along my shoulder, a simple gesture that left my skin tingling. In this business, loyalty and flexibility go a long way, but sometimes they require sacrifice. I swallowed, trying to keep my breathing steady. "I understand, Mr. Graham. I want to do whatever it takes." The look in his eyes shifted slightly, a knowing smile playing at his lips. "That's what I like to hear." His hand slid from my shoulder down to my arm, a slow, deliberate movement that felt almost like a caress. My breath hitched as he stepped even closer, the air between us thick with tension. "Loyalty is rare," he murmured, his fingers tracing a line down my arm. "And when I find it, I like to reward it." I couldn't speak. The feel of his hand against my skin, the intensity of his gaze, it was all too much. My heart was racing, 1,000 thoughts running through my head, but the only thing I could focus on was him, standing so close that I could feel his breath on my face. Then, without warning, he leaned in, his lips brushing softly against my cheek, lingering there for a heartbeat longer than necessary. It was a simple gesture, barely more than a whisper of a kiss, but it left me breathless, frozen in place. I turned, meeting his gaze, and felt something unspoken pass between us. His hand moved to my chin, tilting my face up to his. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. There was no mistaking the look in his eyes now. He wanted this as much as I did. "Do you want this?" he asked softly, his fingers tracing along my jawline. Yes, I whispered, barely able to get the word out. He didn't wait. His lips met mine, soft at first, testing. But as I responded, his kiss deepened, his hands sliding to my waist, pulling me closer. I could feel the strength in his arms, the urgency in his touch. Every nerve in my body was alive, my senses overwhelmed by the feel of him, the scent of his cologne, the warmth of his hands as they traced a path along my back. When he finally pulled back, his eyes were dark, filled with something that made my breath catch. "This is just the beginning," he said, his voice low and commanding. "I don't offer this lightly." "I understand," I replied, my voice shaky but sure. "I want this too." He smiled, a slow, knowing smile that sent a shiver down my spine. "Then let's make sure we understand each other." He stepped back, his hand resting lightly on my arm, his touch a silent promise. "Tomorrow," he said, his gaze lingering on mine. "We'll continue this." I nodded, feeling a mix of anticipation and excitement, the memory of his touch still fresh on my skin. As I left his office, my heart racing, I knew this was only the beginning of something intense, something I couldn't turn back from, even if I wanted to. The next day I could hardly focus on work, still feeling the lingering effects of the previous night. Every sound, every footstep in the hallway made my heart race, wondering if it was him coming to find me. By late afternoon, I could feel his presence before I even saw him. That same magnetic pull seemed to fill the air as he stepped into my office, closing the door quietly behind him. "Good to see you're hard at work," he murmured, his voice laced with an edge of amusement. I managed a nervous smile, suddenly hyper-aware of how close he was. "Just finishing the final report, Mr. Graham." He didn't respond right away, just studied me with those piercing eyes. His gaze felt as though it could see straight through me, cutting to the very heart of my thoughts. Without a word, he moved to stand behind me, resting his hands on my shoulders. The warmth of his touch sent a shiver down my spine. "Relax," he whispered, leaning close enough that his breath brushed my ear. His hands slid down my shoulders to my arms, fingers tracing slow lines along my skin. My breath hitched, and I felt my resolve wavering under his touch. "Mr. Graham," I managed, my voice trembling as he leaned in even closer. "Shh." His voice was barely a murmur, low and soothing. He lifted a hand to my face, brushing his thumb along my cheek. His other hand rested on the back of my neck, sending a rush of warmth through me. I felt myself melting into his touch, the hesitation slipping away. "Let me," he whispered, his lips brushing the side of my neck. I closed my eyes, caught between resistance and surrender. I knew I should pull away, but the feel of his hands, the warmth of his breath, it was impossible to think clearly. "Wait," I managed, forcing myself to pull back just a little, meeting his gaze. "We shouldn't." His eyes softened, a hint of understanding mixed with something deeper, more intense. "I understand," he said, but his hand lingered on my arm, fingers tracing soft circles that sent a thrill through me. He leaned in again, his lips capturing mine in a gentle, lingering kiss that sent a wave of warmth through me. Every instinct told me to resist, to stop this before it went any further. But the moment his hands slid to my waist, pulling me close, I felt my resolve weaken. His touch was magnetic, drawing me in even as I tried to hold back. "Please," I whispered, my voice barely audible. His response was a soft, knowing smile as he held me tighter, his lips tracing a line along my jaw down to my collarbone. I could feel the strength in his arms, the controlled restraint that somehow only made me want him more. He paused, pulling back just enough to meet my gaze. "You can stop me if you want," he murmured, his voice low, filled with a quiet intensity. For a moment I considered it, thought about stepping away, drawing a line. But then his hand slid to the small of my back, drawing me closer, and any thought of resistance dissolved. I was his in that moment, completely and utterly his, Our lips met again, more urgently this time, a blend of desire and surrender that left me breathless. His hands moved to my waist, pulling me closer as the kiss deepened, growing in intensity with each passing second. I could feel my heart racing, the world narrowing to just him, just this. As he led me toward the plush armchair in the corner, I felt a surge of anticipation, a thrill that left me breathless. He sat down, guiding me onto his lap, his hands tracing slow, deliberate paths along my back as our lips met again. This time, there was no hesitation, no holding back. His hands explored my back, my arms, his touch both gentle and commanding. I felt myself surrender completely, lost in the warmth of his embrace, the quiet strength of his hands. His fingers traced along my collarbone, sending a shiver through me, a soft sigh escaping my lips as he kissed my shoulder, his breath warm against my skin. "You're perfect," he murmured, his voice filled with a quiet awe that left me speechless. In that moment, I felt seen, understood in a way I'd never experienced before. The hours seemed to melt away, time blurring as we lost ourselves in each other, exploring the unspoken connection that had been building between us for so long. When he finally pulled me close, his arms wrapping around me in a gentle embrace, I felt a sense of peace, a quiet certainty that this was exactly where I was meant to be. As we lay there, tangled together in the quiet aftermath, he brushed a strand of hair from my face, his gaze warm and tender. "I meant what I said," he murmured, his voice soft. "This is just the beginning." I nodded, feeling a surge of anticipation, knowing that whatever came next, I was ready for it. In that quiet moment, I knew that my life had changed forever, and I couldn't wait to see where this path would lead. The weeks following that tense encounter changed everything. Each time we met, it was like a spark waiting to ignite, both thrilling and terrifying. We barely had a moment to ourselves that didn't feel like a risk, like someone might see or hear something. The secrecy was part of the excitement, but it also felt like a ticking clock. One day, I was summoned to his office for an urgent meeting. I knew exactly what that meant, and my pulse quickened as I made my way through the quiet halls. But as I entered, I felt something different in his demeanor, a tension in his gaze that wasn't just from anticipation. He closed the door, casting a cautious glance down the hallway, and motioned me to sit. But I didn't get far. The moment I was close enough, he reached out, pulling me into his arms with an urgency I hadn't felt from him before. His voice was a low whisper as he admitted he'd been thinking about me nonstop, about everything we'd shared. Just as his hand reached to pull me even closer, we were interrupted by the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching his office door. Panic struck as he moved away, straightening his jacket, while I scrambled to look professional. The door swung open, and there stood his wife, her eyes sweeping across the room and landing on me with a look of surprise. She hadn't seen me here before, and questioned my presence with a raised brow. "I was just going over last month's numbers," I stammered, trying to keep my voice steady, the words feeling heavy with the weight of what almost happened. She seemed unconvinced, her gaze darting between us as if she sensed something was off. The tension was thick, and he cleared his throat, moving the conversation forward by discussing an upcoming charity event. The moment she left, we let out a breath we didn't know we were holding. He looked at me, his eyes shadowed with worry. "We need to be more careful," he murmured, almost to himself. Over the next few days, we attempted to maintain distance, but our resolve faded each time we found ourselves alone. He'd find reasons to bring me into his office or send me tasks that required staying late. And each time we danced closer to the line between secrecy and exposure. A turning point came one evening when I was about to leave work. My phone buzzed, and it was a message from him asking me to meet him at a nearby park. When I arrived, he was already there, pacing under a tree. He confessed that he was feeling overwhelmed by everything, his marriage, his feelings for me, the thrill and fear all tangled together. His words held a weight that was different from before, as if he were opening up a side of himself he usually kept hidden. "It's like you've awakened something in me I thought was gone," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. I felt a surge of emotions, sympathy, understanding, and an undeniable pull toward him. But I also knew that we couldn't keep going like this. The risks were too high, and the guilt was starting to gnaw at both of us. Still, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the cool evening air settled around us, we shared one last quiet moment together, simply sitting side by side, our shoulders brushing. It wasn't the ending we'd expected, but it was something that felt right, if bittersweet. In the end, we agreed to go our separate ways, leaving our shared experiences as a cherished but hidden memory, one that would stay with us, lingering in quiet moments when we least expected it.